Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, can I comment on the men going their own way movement? Sometimes it's called a philosophy, other times it's called a community, and we see the acronym MGTOW is used for this community, and it's referred to as MGTOW. So there's some other questions related to it. Is there a particular personality and mental health profile associated with the MGTOW population? And is MGTOW really a conspiracy theory? So to get started here, what is MGTOW? Well, essentially, it's a philosophy and to some extent a community, more so than really an organized movement. It's not really a group of activists. They're not well organized. Essentially, it's really a collection of websites and forums, sometimes referred to as the manosphere. And there's no standardization of beliefs throughout the system, so it's kind of fragmented into little factions, which makes it kind of hard to study. There's not a lot of research on this construct, and again, there's a lot of different understandings of it. It's really on a continuum. The beliefs are on a continuum. So with these different factions having all these different beliefs within this community, it is difficult to make generalizations, but I have seen some patterns over the years in dealing with a number of people from this community and what little we see in the research literature. Now, the MGTOW population or community is different than men's rights activists, right? Both groups believe that women are not oppressed, but rather men are oppressed, but the activists are actively trying to fix what they believe is the problem through organized events, through activity. And women can be men's rights activists. The MGTOW population is a little bit different because they do not really operate as a community to achieve change. So again, they're not really organized. Rather, they're trying to protect themselves and their resources through a lifestyle choice. So they don't have public meetings, they don't have conferences, and women are not allowed to be a part of the MGTOW community. Now, ostensibly, with this MGTOW population, there are 5 levels, which is kind of interesting because the levels go from 0 to 4, and a lot of times they refer to 4 levels. So I don't know if they're just forgetting to count the 0. Maybe they're just not really good at math. I don't know what's going on here, but 0 through 4 is definitely 5 levels. So just to clear that up. But either way, you can see it's not really an organized philosophy. If they can't even get the level counts correct, that doesn't speak to like a high level of organization. So I'm just going to go based on this idea that there are 5 levels, but really I think there are 3 levels, and the middle level can be divided into 2. So I'll talk about what the levels are as we see it in different online materials, and then I'll discuss, I think, what's really going on in terms of the categorization and how that hierarchy really works. So the first level, the so-called level 0, is what they refer to as situational awareness. Sometimes this is referred to as taking the red pill as opposed to the blue pill, which is a reference to the movie The Matrix, and really the red pill is about trying to understand the truth even if it's frightening, and the blue pill is kind of like going along with society. So kind of, again, a reference to that movie. So this situational awareness level, here we see this belief that the concept of gender equality is essentially propaganda, and furthermore, that feminism is the downfall of Western civilization, or it will be the downfall. So if somebody believes this, they've taken the red pill, in theory, and they're situationally aware, and they've accomplished level 0. Now moving on to level 1, this is when a man has no long-term relationships with a woman, and level 2 is no short-term relationships or sex. So usually we would look at level 2 and think that level 1 is really necessary for level 2 to be kind of someone's position or lifestyle. Now, level 3 and level 4 really depart quite a bit from the rest of the MGTOW philosophy that I've talked about so far, and I kind of put these in a separate category, but again, I'll get to that in a few moments. So level 3 is kind of breaking from society in an economic sense, so believing the government is trying to steal your money, so you only earn enough money to make a living. So here it really starts to sound even more like a conspiracy theory than it did with just the first few levels. Now, level 4 is breaking from society at a physical level, so living off the grid, no more contact with women or men, except perhaps through social media, like someone could still be a member of the MGTOW community in terms of communication. So social media and the internet would still be available at this level 4. But some people have this level 4 positioned a little more strongly, where they don't really contact anybody, and sometimes this is referred to as going monk. But of course that could also be achieved just with the level 1 and 2 together, right? So again, can't emphasize enough that this movement isn't really well organized in the way they've kind of positioned their policies or their beliefs. So now moving to this question, what about the personality and mental health here of the MGTOW group? Well, before I get into my categories where I break that down, it is important to recognize here that somebody could have these beliefs and not have a mental disorder and not have extreme personality traits. These beliefs exist on a continuum, so it would really depend on how extreme somebody was on this continuum, like what their position was in terms of their beliefs. Now, I mentioned before that the so-called levels are really not levels at all. They're really categories. So somebody could choose, for example, to have no long-term relationships and even avoid sex, but still believe in gender equality. So they make it seem like the levels kind of stack on one another, but they don't. They're just categories, and somebody can be in one category and not be in the others. So with that in mind, what are the personality and mental health characteristics? So I've noticed certain tendencies over the years in my clinical experience, and I believe that before there ever was this community, this idea existed. I've seen people throughout the years who have all these levels or some of these levels and even additional levels, even things that MGTOW doesn't cover, who never knew what MGTOW was, and some didn't even have access to the internet. I've seen the MGTOW philosophy manifest differently than the level system that I discussed before. I mentioned, I believe there are 3 categories. The first category would be people that believe that gender equality is propaganda, so that matches with the level 0, but don't really do any of the other things, right? They don't necessarily believe that they should not have relationships with women, and they're not economically and physically isolating. The second category would be people who don't necessarily have an opinion on gender equality or feminism, but have difficulty with women. So they have difficulty in dating situations like awkwardness, or they've had bad experiences with women, like in the family court system. In the last category, here's where I put people who want to economically and physically disengage from society. So to me, this is very distinct from the other beliefs. So merging them together doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but I'll talk about later on how it may make sense from a mental health and personality point of view. So those are the 3 categories that I have. However, it's important to remember that I've technically seen people who can be in all 3 categories at the same time, which would be consistent with how MGTOW represents their levels. But mostly I see people who are really in just one of these categories and only one. So now to break down the mental health and personality characteristics for each category. So with the gender equality category, we really see this as some sort of political belief. It's an unusual belief, especially this idea that feminism is destroying the Western world. But this is still tricky because it is on a continuum. So somebody could have their doubts about gender equality, but not really be an extremist. So again, it just gets difficult to assign really clear mental health or personality characteristics. But in general, I would say elevated paranoia, maybe even paranoid personality disorder in some cases. And with personality, we would see low agreeableness, like on the 5-factor model of personality. We see openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. OCEAN, that's the acronym for it. Again, low agreeableness here. We also see that people in this category tend to have had tough experiences with relationships, like divorce and family court. I mentioned that before, like losing money in family court or losing custody of children. And there's an increased tendency in this category to believe in conspiracy theories. Really, this is true for all 3 of the categories. So sometimes, again, this is just a belief and people don't necessarily act on it. So access to this population is kind of limited because they're not treatment seeking. Somebody isn't going to have an opinion about gender equality that then moves them to come in to see a mental health counselor. Because a political belief is not the same thing as a mental disorder. So again, we just have very little access to observe this population to kind of determine what the characteristics are. Now, the second category would have a stronger and more notable relationship to personality and mental health characteristics. And this is the category, again, with people that don't want long-term or short-term relationships with women. So I typically divide this category into 2 subcategories. Individuals who are socially awkward and individuals who have an aversion to women. So this can be a frustration all the way up to a hatred of women. So with the first subtype, this is actually fairly common. This is a man who actually wants to have a relationship with a woman, but personality and mental health symptoms get in the way. For example, we see characteristics like low extroversion, so being highly introverted, high neuroticism, so being vulnerable to anger and depression and anxiety. We also see mental health characteristics consistent with generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder. And when we look over at personality disorders, we see avoidant, narcissistic, and dependent personality disorders are overrepresented here. So what happens here is sometimes people in this subtype say they dislike women or hate women to explain why they're not successful in relationships. But again, sometimes they really do want relationships with women. Now, the second subtype of this category is a little different. These are men who actually do hate women, and to the level where it's kind of a conspiracy theory. So they act like women don't act as individuals, but are rather in some sort of coordinated effort to persecute men. So here we'd see personality characteristics like being low in openness to experience, mid-range or low in extroversion, low in agreeableness, and I don't really see a particular association here with neuroticism. Now, with that low openness to experience, of course, this leads to rigid and dogmatic thinking, not being good at critical analysis, and somewhat consistent with that, we see some paranoia. Now, overrepresented mental health symptoms would be related to paranoid personality disorder, so a tendency to have a grudge. Again, I think a lot of this has to do with financial loss, like family court. I mentioned that before. We see some association with schizoid and schizotypal. Paranoid and schizotypal altogether are the cluster A personality disorders. So those three personality disorders are put together in one cluster, and that is the odd eccentric cluster. Now, we also see schizophrenia overrepresented. This shouldn't be surprising because this does have an association with conspiracy theories. And we also see narcissistic personality disorder, and this would be someone who's highly self-centered, entitled, and arrogant. Now, moving to the third subtype, this is the economically and physically disengaged. I've seen this a few times. Usually this has nothing to do with women, but I have seen it tied in with women before, so I have seen it kind of in a way consistent with the MGTOW philosophy. The mental health and personality characteristics here would be low extroversion, low agreeableness, and low neuroticism. So somebody is usually fairly calm if they fit into this category where they're willing to disengage from society. We see cluster A personality disorders, I mentioned those before, as well as schizophrenia in terms of the mental disorders. Now, this disorder and personality overlap between those who don't like or don't get along with women and those who want to abandon society might explain what we see with this MGTOW philosophy. MGTOW has put these two categories together even though they really don't make sense, right? The dislike of women wouldn't necessarily lead to an isolation from society. But from a personality and mental disorder perspective, it does make sense, meaning the same mental health and personality characteristics could lead to both beliefs. So again, this explains the overlap in the MGTOW philosophy. So those are my thoughts on the categories. Overall, I think that this philosophy always existed at some level, but we just see more of it now because of the internet. I don't really see it growing dramatically as a philosophy, although frequent communication over the internet and social media with this community has allowed it to grow into a conspiracy theory, in a sense. So I think at many levels it does qualify as a conspiracy theory. Overall, though, I think it's just a small percent of the population that actually falls into any of these categories. So if someone finds themselves really preoccupied with these beliefs, it may be a good idea to talk to a counselor. Counselors don't try to change what people believe. They don't judge, but they can help people to clarify their values and explore the causes and consequences of beliefs and ways of thinking. So I think really talking to a counselor is always helpful, but particularly if somebody's moving toward kind of extreme beliefs that, again, may qualify as a conspiracy theory at some levels. Now, I know whenever I talk about topics like this, like men going their own way and these other topics, there are going to be a variety of opinions, people who agree and disagree with me. Please put those opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the men going their own way community to be interesting. Thanks for watching.